Well, it is my delight and distinct honor and privilege to spend this time interviewing my friend and colleague in the field of homiletics, Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert, who's professor of homiletics at Howard University School of Divinity. Welcome, Dr. Gilbert.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, Dr. Alcantara.
Nice. All right. You're getting better.
Uh,
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gilbert. As you know, this is a course called Learning from Minoritized Preaching Traditions, in which we're interacting with voices in African American homiletics, in Latinx and Latin American homiletics, and then also in Asian North American homiletics. And so this has been a great opportunity for these students to hear sermons, to read wonderful literature, and to also be decentered, because everyone's decentered in some way, in that they're interacting with traditions that they might not be used to interacting with. So I'm grateful just for the opportunity to speak with you, talk to you some more about your work, so that we can learn from and benefit from that work and benefit from learning more about your story. So let's start with a story question. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you grew up, your early experiences of church and of preaching, and then it's a broad question, but those experiences, and then when you knew that God had called you to preach.
wow. Well, thank you so much, my friend. So the question about formation in respect to sort of my origin story, I would just start with my uh, paternal grandfather. So among the rural Black clergy in the Central Texas area, we're in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Um, my grandfather, B.F. Gilbert, standing for Benjamin Franklin Gilbert, was the dean of country preachers in the Waco, Central Texas region. And as the legend goes, he conducted homiletics courses around his home porch. And so hearing some of those stories from my aunt and uh, a bit of uh, a bit from my father, who also served in ministry, it gave a deep impression um, on me to think about ministry in a different way, having grown up around preachers and teachers uh, from the time that I was a child. Now, my father was both a rural church pastor who had come to Waco to pastor Carver Park Missionary Baptist Church, which is where I grew up and came to faith. And from Sunday to Sunday, he would preach from either a pulpit with crutches, or he would preach from his wheelchair. He was a severe arthritic, and God used him in many amazing ways to preach the gospel and serve the congregation. He had done that for about 12 years, and following his retirement, he and my mother began a radio ministry called Walking in Faith Ministries. Now, a little bit more about me. So I started my vocational journey at Baylor. I enrolled in 1992 and completed my bachelor's degree in 4 years. And from there, I matriculated uh, through Princeton Seminary, which is your alma mater as well. And I'm so thankful that I pursued that direction. I'd come to Baylor as a political science major, and with hopes to enter politics. I wanted to, in some way, serve the society through the political arena. But divinely, I think I was interrupted in some ways and shifted my focus to religion. And in that space, I began to prepare myself, not for preaching necessarily, but to get a little deeper immersion in comparative religion and Christian practice in specific. Now, um, and so I would say the end of my freshman year, I felt a burden um, to relent. I was one of those preachers that ran from the call, and there was an event that I now interpret as a supernatural um, experience. I was traveling one summer, the summer prior to my acceptance, to Richmond, Virginia by car, and narrowly missed a tornado storm that had blown through that area. And I said to myself, well, I better I better stop running. And so 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 I accepted my calling. The pastor at the time um, said that, well, I knew that this was on the horizon, so so it wasn't a surprise to him. But again, I knew that a lot of folks, and by this time, I forget, my father died my freshman year, and um, so of course that was a big deal. His funeral service was held in Waco Hall on the campus of Baylor, and I knew that my dad's status was what it was, and so accepting the call also meant a lot of drama in the form of production around what this would be, with his son now entering ministry and declaring his calling uh, to preach. And so I didn't want any parts of that. and and at the time at Baylor, I was the president of the gospel choir, Heavenly Voices, and I knew that they would be invited to sing at that service. So all of the public pressure was there, and I didn't want any parts of it. But I was licensed to preach. Um, Thankfully, I made it through the sermon. I preached on October 31st, 1993, the eve of All Saints Day, Halloween, of course. I was 19, and the sermon that I preached is based on Philippians 4:13, and I titled that message, "What Are You Learning and Who Is Your Teacher?" It was an unforgettable moment for me, but when I look back on it, it was homiletically unremarkable. In other words, it was a bad sermon. It was terrible in my judgment. But the folks in my congregation, the Antioch Church, they were very kind to me and supportive. So I don't know what I would have done had that congregation not supported my call. Um, Following my MDiv degree, I mean my undergraduate degree, I went to Princeton, and there, uh, let me back up just a bit. So, seminary, I did not want to be what would be considered a jackleg preacher or an unofficial preacher. So I knew that I needed to go to seminary. Ended up thinking through going to Southwestern or Dallas Theological. But then Princeton came on my radar. One of our teachers, Cleo LaRue, had already preceded our journey there. And so he was the only person that I knew. And it was an awesome experience in respect to my own formation as a minister. I can't see myself being who I am had I not had that experience. And so I certainly thank God that I did not go to schools in Texas for my ministry training, but that I left home. Um, so I've been preaching now for 27 years. I was ordained my second year in seminary, and the rest is pretty much history. So thank you for that question. Sorry for the prolonged response.
No, I so appreciate every aspect of the response too, and I couldn't help but smile because not every sermon I preached at 19 should go. I'm not sure any of them should go in an anthology of sermons. So, so I thought of the Gardner Taylor line, the miracle of preaching is that it survived so much of our preaching, right?
Ah, that's right.
So that's all good. No, I could resonate with that. Talk to us a little bit more about your journey as a scholar too. So you continued on at Princeton to do your PhD, and you would be too modest to say this, but your first book, The Journey and Promise of African American Preaching, has been a critically acclaimed work that has found a home in many seminaries and divinity schools. So talk to us about that journey in research and scholarship, and then in particular, I have a special interest. Would you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by the term trivocal preaching in that book? I've always appreciated that terminology. It's been memorable to me, especially helpful to me in terms of understanding what you're arguing in that work. So that's another broad question, but I thought just as we track the journey in scholarship, tell us a little bit more about how you got to that project itself and what you mean by trivocal preaching.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, let me say this. I see myself as a practical theologian, theorist, whose specific focus has been homiletics. And in there, I spent more time at Princeton than I had planned to spend in nearly between the time of from my MDiv work through my doctoral program. I was there a total of a decade, and that's too long to be in school in my judgment.
Mm.
However, on the other side of the experience, I developed not only theoretical proficiencies in homiletics, but also a good bit of teaching competence came along with that.
Mhm.
And so, as you know, in many academically rigorous environments, you're not necessarily taught to teach. You,
Mhm.
pretty much you're going to get a wonderful formation in theory work, but pedagogy is a different question altogether. But I knew that that was a part of my passion, and so this first book, The Journey and Promise, really set a foundation or a ground floor for the other works that I've done. And what I sought to do in that book, and I think it's a fairly ambitious book, but prayerfully, there are points in the book that I find accessible to working clergy and homiletic scholars. What I tried to do was to produce a work that was interdisciplinary in reflection, that would bring together Bible, um, theology, social cultural dynamics, and bridge some methodology that I felt was absent coming out of African American preaching traditions. And so in that book, you'll find religious history. You'll also find sermon prep. You'll find sermons. You'll find my reflection on practical theology through more or less an interdisciplinary reflection on preaching. And then you'll also find toward the end of the book a challenge and a charge to preaching from my tradition, and that pretty much has to do with my desire not to romanticize the tradition, but to be critical, self-critical, but also appreciative of this unique tradition that I think has served so many churches well. And so that book has that anchoring, and what I've sought to do in it from a biblical and theological perspective is to ground the theory in Luke chapter 4, Jesus' inaugural vision for preaching. And in that vision, I seek to say that preaching in the Jesus tradition is to be in alignment with what I believe Jesus came to do, and what it means to be the Spirit anointed me is the words are the words that Jesus declared on that day. The Spirit has anointed me to preach the gospel and bring the good news, bring good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. And for me, thinking about that framework as a way to investigate Christian proclamation has been important for me in my work. Um, so, you were going to follow that up with a question about trivocal.
Yes, yes. So the second part of that question would be, talk to us a little more about what you mean by that term trivocal preaching, because it seems like in the book itself,
Right.
you're doing a descriptive work, but you're also making a prescriptive claim for preaching. So talk to us more about that.
Right. And so, so in the best of Black preaching, I've seen these three accents that I also described as being embodied in the witness of Jesus, and through three scriptural images of the prophet, the priest, and the sage. Of course, that's a Trinitarian formula, but I wanted to lift up the work of the local preacher or the sage, and his or her work within that community dynamic. And so trivocal ministry has to do with honoring those three voices and trying to be holistic in one's proclamation. So setting forth a working definition of what is trivocal preaching, I use this working definition. Trivocal preaching is a ministry of Christian proclamation that, as a theoretical discourse, it is about God's goodwill toward community with regard to divine intentionality, which picks up the prophetic theme, communal care, which picks up the priestly aspect of this preaching, and the active practice of hope, which picks up the wisdom, sagely dimension. That finds resources internal to Black life in the North American context. So it's broad, but it's also specific contextually. In that work, I just argue that because the congregational expectations and the things that within Black Christian practice can be a complex thing, I'm arguing that only the African American preacher can reclaim that tradition in a way that can be catalytic and nurture and nourish these communities so that they are able to be profitable to the people of God in this violent, postmodern, fractured environment. And so if those three voices are not present, or if one is in disregard of the other, I see that as anemic in one's preaching. And so yeah, that's trivocal preaching in a nutshell.
Last question is just a pedagogy one. It's something I've been asking every interviewee. What would be your counsel for the future teachers of preaching? Some of our students would be learned pastors in training who will also train in the future.
Sure.
But as you think about the future teachers of preaching and trainers in preaching, what would be your counsel to them for how best to affirm, respect, honor African-American students, colleagues in their classroom settings? And then what would be your counsel for how they can best inform, shape, broaden the horizons of white majority students as well? So it might be that our classrooms are getting more diverse, but in most seminaries and divinity schools, they're still predominantly white.
Sure.
So what would be your counsel in those two areas: how to honor, respect, affirm African-American students in their spaces of influence, circles of influence, and how to help shape, broaden the horizons of white majority students?
Right. No, that's excellent. excellent question. So the first thing I would say is be self-critical. Realize that we all have blind spots, irrespective to race, ethnicity, and theological perspective. But also be critical of of how we have received our traditions, and to think about the religious heritage of the persons who populate our classrooms and honor them. And the best way to honor them is to help them uh, to name their own reality,
Mm.
and um, and help them, um, or be open enough to hear ways in which their contributions are on par with any other um, Eurocentric pattern or tradition or methodology. Um, and unfortunately, but fortunate in the sense that we are presently doing our work as scholars in the field. There's literature now that I think is kind of moving um, to sophistication, um, that there is no excuse why our white counterparts, be they professors or preachers, um, um, there's no excuse why they can't engage these works in a very serious way. I think what the beloved community looks like is pursuing in an open way um, ways to understand um, our particular yet our particular contributions, but striving for a more universal outcome. And I think that that's an articulation of the beloved community. Now, I've been particularly um, concerned about evangelical witness, particularly as I've seen historically evangelicalism align itself with political agendas that don't serve the world well. And I think it's important that homiletics professors focus on less on interior um, pietistic modes of preaching, as well as be open to um, preaching approaches that are not evangelistic centered or mission centered, because I don't think you, European American or European theologians, homileticians, have done the real digging to question some of these um, imperialistic, um, colonizing notions of these traditions that have been um, tyrannical in the sense that others' voices are diminished or dominated by this one-sided narrative. And in order for people of color, um, specifically African Americans, as my work has focused, in order for them to decolonize their minds, they'll have to read widely. They'll have to know that there are other voices that are um, moving to the center in the conversation that will be helpful to the church broadly. I think, when we inject these hegemonic biases, be they liberal or conservative, in our theoretical work without questioning how they impact human life, uh, I think we further oppress communities of color. Um, the um, the work of just expanding one's circle. So for me, for example, if you are teaching even one student of color, if you've not visited a congregation of color that's predominantly African American, then shame on you for not developing a sense of wisdom based on one's experiential um, engagement. Because I think your wisdom impoverished if, in fact, you don't transgress certain uh, cultural boundaries. And I think again that's why your work, um, Jared, is so important, because you you're picking up this intercultural um, dynamic that's so important, and that preachers of color have had to navigate and negotiate for such a long time. How do you honor your own particularity in your own churches, be that, in a call and response environment, and then be improvisational enough, or keen enough to be in other spaces and feel that you have a contribution to make. And so the way in which you present Gardner Taylor as being one of those persons who is able to do that should not be as much a rarity as it is, um, I just think it's important, and you bringing a Latinx perspective in the mix, just enriches and broadens what we can do and what we need to do moving forward.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Gilbert, and for all the great work that you have done and are doing. As you were reflecting on that too, I thought that sagely witness applies to homiletics professors too, right? That being the sort of teacher of preachers who exercises wisdom would be that much more important in the future of preaching. And when you were describing preachers of color navigating spaces in which the home church tradition is honored and respected, but then having to navigate improvisationally in other spaces, that requires an immense amount of sagely wisdom, of witness, to be able to do that, and to do that well is especially important. So thank you so much for your willingness to interact with us, to share some of your story and to talk about your research and interests, and to reflect on classroom environments as well, and the importance of thinking, acting, being in these ways. So it means a lot to me that you were willing to tithe your time with me today. So thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.